Today's lecture, we'll be going over visualization through human eyes. Basically, we're going to be talking today about how we can leverage properties of human visual cognition in order to convey data through visualization. So putting kind of a human-centric emphasis on data visualization. The reading for today will be Familiarity et al., The Science of Visual Data Communication, What Works. If you have not read this chapter, please pause, go read it, and come back. Today's discussion is oriented around two main points. First, we're going to go over what the human visual system sees. So properties of the human visual system that bias the way we extract information. And then in the second half, we're going to go over how you can use this information to work with these visual biases in order to convey visual information. So let's start by describing what the human visual system sees. Humans, like almost every other animal, don't actually see a veridical world based off of their sensory experiences. We see the world based off of our internal expectation, priors that are built in from our experience through evolution, that are computational shortcuts for our brain in order to perceive the world, but these biases, these constraints, often lead to biases in perception. So for example, take a look at this grid on the right. To your eyes, you might see that some lines are curved and some are straight. But look carefully. There are no curved lines. This is a visual illusion. Our eyes provide information to our brain, and our brain tries to process that in the most efficient way possible for goals that our brain was evolved to meet. As a result, there are certain biases that our visual system has that impacts how we perceive things in the visual world. One bias we have is in the degree of precision of our visual channels. So the different types of visual information our eyes get have different degrees of precision. Now, for today's discussion, we're going to define precision as the ability by which viewers can verbally state the relations between two values when visually presented. This is going to be our definition of the term precision. So we can lay out different types of visual information along a continuum from high precision to low precision. The visual feature that has the highest precision at understanding relations between two values is position. Relative position of spatial information, according to our eyes, has the highest degree of precision in terms of distinguishing relative values and relations. This is followed by perception of length, perception of area, perception of angle, and visual intensity. You want to be aware of these differences in precision when plotting your data or using different visual features to plot your data, because certain visual features, like intensity or angle, may impact the degree or precision by which people extract information. One example of this is reference frames, or the framing or scaling of information and how that can bias understanding. We know that mapping visual ratios to numbers can lead to perceptual and inferential errors. This goes back to early days of data visualization. In fact, the book How to Lie with Statistics takes advantage of this problem as a demonstration of ways to kind of tweak the reader's perception. You probably have seen this a lot with the scale of an X or a Y axis. And this is an example from the book How to Lie with Statistics. On the left, you have some chart of our gross domestic product over months. So we have months on the x-axis and GDP in billions on the y-axis. So you can see that there is a trend line going up from 20 to 22. But if you wanted to make this look like a, milder effect, you could show the full range of GDP, shown here on the left. You could scale the axes, the y-axes, to focus in just on the little bit of change. But if you really wanted to emphasize and make it look like we're showing great growth, you would scale the axes just between the minimum and maximum of that line, shown here on the right. Now the graph on the right has a different reference frame than the graph on the left. And in the graph on the right, the slope of change looks much steeper. It looks like GDP is growing much faster than it is. This is a classic trick for how to influence the viewer's perception of the rate of change by simply changing the scale of the y-axis. Now this is important. It doesn't always have to lead to intentional misrepresentation of effects. Really, sometimes this scaling might be necessary for just understanding patterns. So for example, if we look at the global temperature of the entire Earth across years from 1850 to the year 2000, if I actually scale the range in Fahrenheit from 0 to 100, it doesn't look like there's been much of a change in temperatures. However, if I reduce the scale to ranges that are within the normal variability of global temperatures, you see very quickly that we are showing this acceleration of global temperature that's linked to the effect of climate change. So sometimes the scaling of the reference frame or changing of the axis range is necessary in order to not hide effects. So designers need to consider the practical relevance of scale and reference frames when thinking about how they want the viewer to encode the visual information. It's not a easy heuristic to just say scale axes or don't scale axes. You have to fundamentally think about the way that you can accurately convey information without amplifying certain effects. Now, this is just one example of how practical features of data visualization can lead to biases. There are other very common illusions and misperceptions that happen when viewing data or data visualizations. So for example, hue and position can lead to perceived distance or difference errors. One classic example shown in the reading is this graph here. You've got two lines, a black line and a gray line, both increasing with an exponential shift. Now, it looks like the distance between the two lines is getting smaller as they accelerate. But that's not true. Each one of the red lines, showing the distance between the black and the gray lines, are the exact same height. In fact, the black line is simply shifted by 1,000 points up the y-axis. Otherwise, the slope is the same. But our eyes perceive the two lines getting closer. They're perfectly parallel, but our eyes see them as getting closer. This gives you a false sense of conjunction of lines that, in this case, would be separate. Another common visual illusion is that contrast and context can skew perceptions of intensity. This goes back to early work by David Marr on his classic book on vision. But in data visualization, this happens all the time. So for example, you see these two gray squares. Well, these two gray squares look like they have different intensity depending on what's in the background. If the background's darker, it looks less intense. If the background is lighter, it looks darker. And this can impact how you actually perceive relative value. So for example, take this green dot here. The background, whether it's within the square or outside the square, actually impacts your sense of distance. So the distance between the green dot and the top of the bar is actually the same in both the left and the right plot. But the background and foreground contrast on the green dot causes a bias in your perception such that the plot on the left looks like the dot is nearer to the top of the bar than the plot on the right. Also, combining across dimensions, visual dimensions, can lead to spurious inferences of associations. One way we see this all the time is when looking at scatter plots. So a scatter plot is perfectly fine for showing the joint distribution between two distributions of variables, here plotted on the x and y axes. Now for this plot, the authors just used a normal random number generator, so a Gaussian random number generator, same parameters. But these are two independent runs, so they're perfectly independent. However, our visual system tries to look for patterns. And as a result, outliers, say that point in the lower right-hand quadrant of the joint distribution, pulls your vision. And it looks like the joint distribution, the scatter plot, is skewed. It looks like there's a negative association between these two variables. Weak. But if you were asked, is there an association, some people might say, yeah, it looks like there's a slight negative correlation, when in fact, these are perfectly uncorrelated variables. And this is because we're trying to make inferences now across two dimensions and trying to estimate the relative position between points in that space. And this leads to this kind of spurious sense of association by having our vision and our perception drawn by these noisy outliers. Now, as you add in more information, you kind of fill in the total scatter plot. It makes it, the influence of each one of these outliers on our perception decreases, but this is a common thing that we see in data visualization. Finally, humans tend towards categorical biases, even when no categories are present. For a host of reasons, our brains try to force visual information into categories. Think about a rainbow. When you see a rainbow in the sky, you see a discrete set of colors. But a rainbow is not made of discrete sets of colors. It's a continuum of color. But our brain forces these fuzzy boundaries between colors so that we discretize the rainbow, and it looks like it's a discrete set of colors. One example shown in the reading is this cover from The Economist plotting global temperature across time from left to right using a color scale. So now we're using color and hue along with spatial dimensions and positions to convey the change in climate scale. But what people see is a blue bar or blue set of bars on the left and red set of bars on the right, as if there's a dichotomous state transition in global temperature as you go from blue to red. So it gets this false sense of a state transition when really this is a continuous function. Another place we see this all the time is in visualization of brain imaging data. So here are two brain imaging maps showing the exact same statistics. So the color maps of the orange and yellow on the top are plotting the same quantitative information as the maps on the bottom showing red to green, green to yellow to orange. Now, our mind sees greater difference in values as we go from green to yellow to orange than as we go from orange to yellow in the top plot. It looks like there's a greater difference of activity in the brain on the bottom than the brain on the top, even though the statistical values that go into the map are identical. So these are some common visual perception biases or illusions that can lead to misperceptions of data. Now what we want to do is we want to say, hey, can we work with these visual biases? Now that we know what biases we have in terms of how our visual system extracts information, how do we work with them in order to make efficient data visualizations? Let's start with trying to extract out very simple statistics, means and differences and distributions. Well, there are particular channels of visual information that allow for us to very quickly extract this sort of information from visual data. First and foremost, there's position, there's one-dimensional length, two-dimensional areas, angles, and intensities. So these 5 channels of visual information all are useful for conveying very quick extraction of simple statistics. Let me show you as an example here. I'm going to show a very quick presentation of a scatter plot. And I want you to tell me, are X and Y associated? Now, from that quick flash of the scatter plot, you probably saw that there was a positive correlation between X and Y. You would say that they were probably positively associated. But there were actually also two groups in there as well. There was a group of diamonds and a group of circles. Were they different? Could you tell that there were two groups, and could you tell that they were different? That sort of contrastive analysis requires greater information. And the patterns that you picked up were just the simple association. In fact, if I replot them now showing the groups in color, you can quickly discern the two groups and see that they have different slopes. But in your initial quick grab of visual information by having such a brief presentation of the scatter plot, only allowed for you to see that global pattern of association. We also know, almost by contrastive point, that comparisons are a processing limit in visual perception. Seeing general statistical relations, value, distribution, correlations, that's fast. We could do that, as I just showed in the last slide. However, extracting relationships and differences is very slow. It requires a complex visual scan of information in the visual field. So for example, I'm going to show you a plot of student performances, just a set of students, at 2 time points. And I want you to tell me which student got worse. So which student has a line that goes from being high to being low, as opposed to pairs of lines that go from low to high? Take a moment to look at the plot. Do you see the student who got worse? That's right, Steve got worse. But it took a while for you to be able to see that difference. It required scanning and comparing and looking for patterns across individuals. Now, sometimes you can use additional information, a different visual channel, to make these sorts of differences pop out. So for example, if I just change this plot so that instead of Steve, it's Evan, but Evan now is plotted in red, even though this is all the same data, you can very quickly see which student got worse. There's a pop-out cue that allows for you to see and highlight which student is different than the rest. This pop-out effect drives our visual attention system to the point of the difference. Other techniques that can be used to kind of highlight these differences is plotting the differences themselves. So as opposed to, let's say you have this pre-post test kind of data, instead of plotting pre and post together, plot the differences, sometimes known as plotting the deltas. So now, instead of trying to see these differences between these pairs of points, so we have A, B, C, D, E, F, all are pairs of points, and we want to know what's the difference in differences. Well, if I subtract each one and plot them on the line on the right, you can easily see which letters, in this case A, C, and E, go up, and which letters, B, D, and F, go down. So this is another plotting trick that can be useful for making comparisons which have this visual processing limit that are very taxing on the visual system. In fact, let's dig into this a little bit. How can we use visual information to facilitate comparisons? One very easy trick in order to draw the visual system into making comparisons is to use visual grouping. I sort of did that in the last plots, or I showed this in the last plots on the previous slide, where I had that red example student pop out. The student who got worse as opposed to got better is plotted in red. That student was now in their own visual group because they were colored differently. So proximity and hue and shape are all natural cues for similarity and grouping respectively. If you can use different visual features to define groups, it makes comparisons much easier for the reader and viewer. Just here are some examples of ways to use grouping that are more or less effective at quickly discerning groups. So for example, you can have connecting lines that have different colors, so it's very easy to see what is group 1 and what is group 2, in this case A and B. You can plot A and B, the same data, separately, but now just along their dimensions. So the plot in the lower left and the plot in the upper left are showing the same data, just along two different dimensions. And the way which dimension you choose, A versus B or east, north, south, west, determines how the reader sees the differences along those dimensions. If we move to the right of the plot here, we can also focus on how we cluster that same data. So if we put it in tabular format here, you can see we have a clean distinction between the A and B categories as opposed to A versus B within north, south, east, and west. Now, those are powerful for being able to quickly discern group differences. Other ways of really making things pop is by choosing colors, as I showed before, or hue in this case. So here on this third column, you see that at the top, A is in blue and B is in red, and it's very easy for a visual system to discern the difference between A and B. On the bottom, we're grouping now not A versus B, but directionality, so east, west, north, south are different colors, and it's easy to very quickly see which dots belong to the north group and which dots belong to the east and west group. Now shapes still allow for this discernment as well, but it's less easy for a visual system to kind of extract these grouping differences in order to facilitate comparisons. So far, we've talked about using grouping and high precision visual channels to facilitate this very kind of quick bottom-up extraction of information, facilitate both low effort and high effort visual processing. But there's a top-down problem that we run into when trying to design information for readers that is very difficult to manage. And oftentimes, if you're writing scientific papers, it integrates almost immediately how you write your text versus how you plot your information. And that's the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is the inability to simulate the perspective of another viewer. You've been working with this data for months or years, you know it very intimately. There's lots of priors that come into how you think about the data that oftentimes are implicit by the time you're trying to plot your data for a paper or for a talk. And prior knowledge guides how viewers see the graphic. Even something as simple as telling a story. In this case, let's say reading a story about data that's plotted in a graph. In this case, you can think about it if you're writing a scientific paper, it's how you describe patterns of associations in your text, and then the reader's eye moves up to the figure that plots that information. Viewers will attend to different parts of graphs depending on that narrative. So for example, here, these are results from a study showing how readers, when given a story about these international groups or these different groups and how they vote across time, the particular story that they read drives the way that they look at the data. So the top row shows one group of subjects who were told a story specifically about the Labor and Conservative parties at specific dates in this timeline. The bottom row shows the same data, same pattern of data, but the story talks about the Alliance and United parties. So it's the same visual data. It's just that one group hears about one set of parties, the Labor and Conservatives, the other hears a story about Alliance versus United. On the right, what you're seeing are graphs of where participants are fixating on the graphs. And you can see just by telling a story strictly about the Labor and Conservative Party, viewers spend more time analyzing those lines than the other lines. And then vice versa for the readers or viewers who were told stories about the Alliance and United group. So just simply the narrative of which you write your results or talk about your results guides how viewers actually look at the information on the page. We also know that visual features like color and shading, etc., guide the viewer's eyes. And you can use this to guide viewers to different parts of patterns in an overall data set. So here's an example here. This is, let's say, unemployment over time. And so you see unemployment goes up and it goes down between 2008 and 2013. Now, let's say this is America and you want to put a positive spin on it and you're a Democrat. So, and this happens to be during the Obama administration. So you're going to want the viewers to see the downward slope. So your narrative and your bias will show the downward slope. In fact, doing this blue arrow to highlight the negative trend after the initial dip, that's going to highlight the parts of the data that you want. But if you're a conservative, shown on the right, and you want to say that nothing has changed, nothing's improved, well, in that case, you want to highlight that roughly between the start and the end, unemployment hasn't really changed, right? Overall, unemployment stays the same. So in this case, you're trying to say that nothing's changed, nothing's effective, even though it's showing the exact same data. And in fact, you can use annotations and color for direct inference on these visual information. So for example, this is the exact data I'm showing above, but now you can add in annotations like in 2008, the president promised unemployment rates of 8% before 2011, yet in 2011, unemployment was still at 9%. By showing the line right at the 8% mark, you're kind of showing the same kind of conservative viewpoint that you want people to see. By having the demarcation of 2011, which seemed relatively arbitrary, by using two different colors, you can see that there's this low mass on the right and a big mass on the left. And so here, the annotations in the graph tell the reader in the graph what they should be seeing. You go from being unsettled to extremely unsettled here, right? You're telling them what to see, but you're putting it all in one place, as opposed to having readers have to read text on the screen or a paper, and then shift their eyes from that text to the data visualization and try to carry in mind what they've been reading. Here, you explicitly tell them what they should extract in the figure. This is a very powerful way for highlighting the necessary features of visual information in a data graphic and having readers extract exactly what you want them to extract. Now, the cursive knowledge also reminds us that working memory matters. In this whole example here, what you're doing by putting annotations in the figure is you're reducing the effort of the working memory system so that they don't have to carry over information from written text into visual formats. So that's a generally good rule for data visualization, is try as much as you can to avoid taxing working memory. People answer questions about data faster and more accurately when the data are directly labeled in a graph rather than on legends or captions. And these are three different ways of showing that using the same data. So each one of these plots is plotting the same data. In the plot on the left, you see that we just directly labeled which is group A, which is group B, which is group C, and which is group D. You see it all in the same fixation. Whereas the color legend and the shape legend requires scanning back and forth from the lines themselves and the legend or caption that defines what each of the lines are. It's much easier for a viewer to see the patterns, even if you're not using fancy colors or fancy shapes, if you simply put the labels next to the lines as opposed to nesting them in legends. Now, if you have just a simple dichotomous group distinction, like you just have two groups and you make them one a purple and one an orange, that can be not very taxing in working memory. You could probably put the group labels in a legend or in a caption. But as you add in the number of dimensions or the number of levels along a dimension, you want to quickly move from using other visual features like color or hue to define group to actually defining group labels in the figure itself. Now, one way to help this tax on working memory is to work with your viewer's own priors. we know that familiarity facilitates comprehension. And what I mean with familiarity is familiarity in plotting and graphic styles. So we can define a graph schema as a knowledge structure that includes default expectations, rules, and associations that a viewer uses to extract conceptual information from the data visualization. In other words, as people become more familiar with certain plotting styles, like the time series plots that I've been using throughout this lecture, it makes it easier for them to understand them. There's a frame of reference for how to read the plot that they're familiar with. That reduces the amount of scanning and visual search that they need in order to understand the visual information. And you can even use these priors, these graph schemas, to extract information from ambiguous sources. So for example, here's just a random plot of gross domestic product versus population. Now, you'll notice that there are two dimensions by which quantitative information are being presented here. There's size of the circles, and then there's colors. So, what's what? Which dimension is plotting GDP, and which is plotting population size? I'll give you a minute. Do you see it? Given your prior knowledge of, let's say, population, you can very quickly extract the understanding that size maps to population, because China and India, the two most populous countries in the world, are both the largest circles. So that tells us that the size dimension is reflecting population size. We also know that the United States of America and China have the largest gross domestic product of any countries in the world. And so we can infer that more red colors means larger GDP. You didn't have to have complex labeling. You didn't have to have, a lot of excessive descriptions. You could infer that even when presented in this kind of ambiguous way. And that's because you have this pre-existing graph schema. And you also have prior knowledge that comes in terms of trying to infer which dimension is what. Now, when you work with these graph schemas, when you try to rely on your viewer's priors, you can also, in some ways, overlook more effective ways of plotting information. So, for example, look at this time series plot on the left. Here I'm plotting two different values across time. First, I'm plotting number of troops in the 1,000. That's shown in purple or blue. And then I'm showing budget spent on the military, shown in green. And you can extract that there's this kind of negative relationship across time as the number of troops plummets, but budget expenditures increases. However, you could compress this information into a single line if you use this vector plot, this watering plot. Here, I'm plotting number of troops on the x-axis and budget on the y-axis, and time is represented by an arrow. You can follow time in unspecified units as it goes from high number of troops to high expenditures and budgets as a single simple dimension. Now, this specialized form deviates from your standard graph schema, so it requires a lot more visual scanning in order to understand it, but at the same time, it's a much more efficient way of presenting the visual information. It requires a lot more viewing, but it also leads to kind of a deeper understanding of the relationship between military budgets and number of troops. And so you really want to respect your viewers' assumptions. You want to really rely as much as you can on the expected assumptions that viewers are going to look at your data through. And some assumptions are universal. I should probably put universal in quotes here. But by and large, they are mostly universal. So for example, one universal assumption that viewers have is that length or area, either one, more, as you increase length or increase area, that means more. as you decrease length, as you decrease area, that means less. So value, arbitrarily specified, goes up or down with length or area. You don't have to specify that. Viewers will get it. In fact, we saw that on the GDP graphic in the last slide. Greater area was mapped to something that we knew, in this case, population size. And so we immediately inferred that bigger was more. Now, in some ways, these default assumptions will depend on the type of data you're trying to plot. So for example, metric data or quantitative data, things that are continuous in units, those map very easily along things like position, length, area, angle, or intensity, because those can be very continuous dimensions. Positions can get continuously longer or shorter, or move around the space in a continuous way. Areas can get continuously bigger or smaller, same with angles and intensities. However, nominal data or categorical data, qualitative data, that maps more easily onto things like position, color, and shape. So color is a discrete, as I said before, we see it in discrete units, so that maps fairly easily onto discrete categories. Same with shapes. Shapes are unique, and so differences in shapes indicate different unique categories. Now, you want to be very respectful of the viewer's assumptions, because that can lead to misinterpretations of your data during visualization. So for example here, consider this plot that's showing deaths over time. Now, the plot is trying to show that deaths are going down. That bottom line of that rhombus is going down. However, by choosing to use this funky shape, what the reader sees is deaths increasing, because the area of that object is increasing as you go from 1950 to 2025. Another example of this kind of violation of expectations would be something like this. Here, we're plotting where cars are made. So we've got two types of nominal data. We've got country on the x-axis, and we've got car manufacturer on the y-axis. But by plotting them using these bars, what we're inferring is that Honda and Toyota are somehow more of something than Fiat, Ford, or BMW. When realistically, this is just making a strictly categorical presentation of data. But because length we assume to reflect metric data or quantitative data, we automatically make that quantitative inference from these different lines. So we have to think carefully about how readers and viewers encode visual information. This we went over a lot in the last lecture on data visualization. But you want to think carefully about the difference between bottom-up and top-down visual information. Bottom-up information is really good for presenting saliency of visual data. However, top-down visual processing is really good for extracting features. Let's consider for a moment this plot, which shows basically the result of different runs of simulations from 538 of the 2020 election. Now, very quickly, the bottom-up information gave you the spatial distribution. You saw that the cluster of points were shifted to the right. We saw that there were much more blue than there were red. So we could extract a blue bias here. However, after that initial bottom-up saliency of that shift, in order to extract more information from this plot, which is really informative, it's kind of showing us this range of possible universes where Trump wins or Biden wins through these simulations or these Monte Carlo simulations, we can see the general patterns. But if we want to know specifics like how much is Biden favored to win over Trump, and where is the likely electoral margin of victory going to be, that requires a lot of top-down effort. It requires a lot of visual interpretation of the graph. And so when you first saw this graph, all this rich salient information popped up, but it was all simple. And we encoded the information first from that saliency, and then scanned the graphic to extract out other features that were actually, facilitated by that saliency. So you want to think about how readers encode visual information as this continuum from bottom up and top down. These two ways of processing visual information work together. So you can highlight very quickly relevant dimensions, in this case Biden versus Trump, using things like space and color. And then you can use that to facilitate how the reader scans the graphic in order to extract out things like probability and, let's say, margin of victory. Now, this plot also brings up a very crucial point. By showing these different simulations, what the data visualizer is showing is also a degree of uncertainty. And communicating uncertainty is crucial for data visualization. It is also one of the hardest things to do. Now, in scientific visualization, we often use things like error bars to show variability or uncertainty. However, error bars are highly specialized and prone to misunderstanding. This is true even for professional scientists. So for example, I'm going to show you the same data plotted 3 different ways. On the plot on the left, I'm showing the mean and plus or minus 1.95 standard errors of the average sliding distance, I forget what this is for, between a standard boulder and a special boulder. The importance of the 2 groups isn't really that big. Really what I want you to pay attention to is the mean and the error according to how they're plotted. Now the standard error is an estimate of your confidence in your mean. It's the standard deviation divided by the square root of n. If I take the same data and I just plot the 95% confidence intervals on the standard deviation instead, which is a reflection of the spread of the distribution, the differences between the 2 groups disappears, right? In fact, the scale on the y-axis has to expand in order to accommodate the broad range of data. Now, the plot on the far left, you would say there's a significant difference between the special boulder and the standard boulder. However, the plot in the middle, you wouldn't, because they look the same. Now, if we took approximately the same axes as the standard deviation plot, but then plotted the standard error using those scaled axes, what you actually do is you increase the perceived certainty of the difference between the 2 groups. And that's because now those error bars are really, really small. It's the same error, the same plot as the plot on the far left. However, in the plot on the far right, you get the sense that the results or the separation between the groups is much more certain just because we've compressed that length due to changing of the y-axis. So you can see how same data presented in vastly different ways can lead to different estimates of uncertainty. So you want to communicate uncertainty effectively and accurately. And we know that some visual channels provide the subjective impression of uncertainty better than others, but this can actually happen at a lower perceptual precision. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at some different ways of plotting both mean values and uncertainty. So here we're going to use color and saturation as indicating relative value and uncertainty respectively. So you have this bivariate map of value and uncertainty. As you go from red to purple to blue, you're increasing relative value. As you decrease the saturation of the color, you're increasing uncertainty. So that more faint, more whitish kind of hues are more uncertain. As they get more robust in their color, they're more certain, and then the color tells you about value. So the bivariate map on the top left shows a fairly accurate way of thinking about the differences between value and uncertainty. You can kind of compress this visually by changing that square to this kind of cone shape. In this case now, all of uncertainty is compressing down to a single point. And as a result, what you're actually doing is this suppresses the perceived value as you decrease uncertainty. So the value differences, even though the value differences are effectively the same between, let's say, the light pink on the second from the bottom row and the color next to it, they're just different in value. It seems as if they have different values. If we just throw those into some random data set at the bottom, it's very hard to kind of extract out both the value and the uncertainty together. So you want to think carefully about visual channels that provide this impression of uncertainty, but keep in mind that some of these channels, like hue or color or saturation, can actually lead to imprecise estimates of uncertainty. Those two matrices at the bottom are using the same uncertainty and value scale as the two plots on the top. But it's very hard to differentiate differences in value from differences in uncertainty in that data. So you want to think creatively about presenting uncertainty in your graphics, while at the same time trying to maximize the precision of that estimate of uncertainty. Now finally, the kind of final problem we always have to work around with humans is that humans struggle with understanding probabilities. This is true just at a conceptual level, and it's very true at a visual level. We have a very hard time really understanding probabilities. And so from a graphics perspective, the solution to this problem is to present probabilities as frequencies or samples. So for example, think about the hurricane risk maps that you typically see. So this is a map of a hurricane that's going to hit Florida and Alabama and Georgia. And we're all familiar with the kind of cone of uncertainty that follows the tornado. So the present moment, sorry, not the tornado, the hurricane. At the present moment, in the far left, there's low uncertainty because that's the position of the hurricane. But as time moves on, as it gets closer and closer to shore, the certainty of its location increases. Sorry, the uncertainty of its location increases. So that cone gets bigger. And that cone reflects roughly 95% probabilities of where the hurricane will be in the future. Now, humans have a really hard time with this. We tend to just see things being inside that cone or outside that cone. Or we infer that the hurricane's going to get bigger as it approaches land, and that's not true. So an alternative way of plotting this uncertainty is to just plot estimated trajectories, either using, actual data of actual, hurricanes or simulations of hurricanes, or smoothed out data like you see on the right. Both of these cases, we're just taking a few sample runs of discrete trajectories and plotting those on the map. For a viewer, even though this is conveying slightly less information because they're just discrete samples of simulation runs of the hurricane's path, they're conveying to the reader that it could be any one of these lines. And readers kind of fill in the gaps in the middle. And this is a much more powerful way of conveying to the viewer that what you're plotting is possible paths of the hurricane than the graphic at the top, the cone of uncertainty at the top. And this translates into how humans perceive risk as well. The problems with understanding probabilities leads to problems in understanding risks. Because risk fundamentally relies on understanding probabilities. And there's two ways to think about risk. There's absolute risk, which is just the overall probability of an experience occurring. And then there's relative risk, a comparison of absolute risk between two categories or groups. Now, both of these at a hypothetical level are fine. However, humans have a problem which is known as denominator neglect. People pay more attention to differences in numerators than denominators, which leads to false senses of risk when using relative risk. So if one group has twice the risk of contracting COVID than another, people will assume that that second group that has twice the risk is twice as risky or is twice as dangerous, when the base rates for contracting COVID might be 1%. So you just have a group go from 1% risk to 2% risk. And the overall risk to an individual hasn't changed that much. So relative risk is hard, but it's also the default that people go to. They tend to think about relative risk. It's easier for them to comprehend, but as a result, they misinfer it. So what do? Well, the recommendation is to always present absolute risk. So for example, here's a plot of the probability of people with symptoms of arterial disease, where we have 10 grids of dots representing each person. So this is a 1 in 100 risk, or this is a out of 100 risk. And you can see the black dots indicate the risk, or how many people out of 100 would show symptoms of arterial disease. And then you can present how something like aspirin might reduce that risk. So it's clear that people taking aspirin have fewer black dots than people not taking aspirin. But you actually get an accurate sense of the probability change as a result of taking aspirin by showing the absolute probability values and showing them as frequencies. So this is why a lot of times you will see epidemiology plot rates as values out of 100,000 or values out of 1,000,000, because that pushes probabilities into frequencies, and it's much easier for viewers to understand those frequencies. But you want to be accurate in how you convert that frequency into probabilities. Now, let's just kind of tie everything together with the guidelines that we've gone over for data visualization for humans. Visualize your data before applying statistics. You always want to take a look at how to present your data and try to understand your data visually before applying any statistical models. Beware of visual illusions and misperceptions. Remember that comparisons are slow, but extracting global statistics from graphics are fast. Avoid taxing working memory. Remember that new visualizations, while they might be cool, must be learned as new graph schemas. People require some time to learn new graph styles. Graph comprehension depends on both bottom-up and top-down visual processing, and these two work together to guide how viewers perceive your data. You want to communicate your uncertainty effectively. And in the special case of working with probabilities and risk, you want to convey probabilities as frequency and highlight absolute, not relative risks. So the overall take-home message from this lecture is that for the foreseeable future, data visualization is used to convey information to humans. So understand human perceptual abilities, i.e. these visual biases that we have, when making decisions about the graphical form of your data.